But I'm looking at it on YouTube and I don't see it.
Here we go. All right. Now it says we're live. So there'll be a short delay, guys. Again, I apologize. This is all my fault that we're a little late. YouTube has done some updates to the system, and I did not keep up with that. It's coming up now. All right.
Oh yeah.
I apologize. Yeah. Let me know that you guys can see and hear us, and we'll get started. I'm very excited to have with me today my good friend. I consider him a good friend. Now, he may deny knowing me.
But well, the jury's still out, man. I don't know. I'm still waiting for more evidence.
Yeah. My friend Adam Coleman. Adam runs a YouTube apologetics channel, Tru-ID Apologetics. He does a whole ton of stuff. Brilliant man. And I wanted to introduce him to you all. Now, I know a lot of you guys know Adam. Now, one of the reasons he's on this channel isn't just because of the topic, guys. You know, I typically have on our channel academics predominantly. Adam is a high-level thinker. Doesn't matter what his degree, background, anything is. I'm not kidding y'all. When we talk, I'm following what he's saying. I'm tracking 100% because he's a brilliant man. And I want you guys to get a chance to hear what he has to say because it's really that good. And I also would encourage, if you have not checked out his channel, Tru-ID Apologetics, there's a link down in the description below. Please check out his channel. If you like it, subscribe. If you like it a lot, consider supporting him over on his Patreon channel. That's also down in the description below. Seriously, y'all. I mean, I'm not just saying this to butter Adam up. I don't get anything from that, but he really is a brilliant guy.
I appreciate that, man. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, brother. And yeah, so anyway, Adam, it's great to have you. Anything else you want that I missed that you wanted to mention in introducing yourself to everybody?
Did you mention that I was brilliant and humble as well? I want to make sure that in, you know. No, man, that's great, man. I appreciate you having me on. I mean, of course, we met a couple of months ago, you know, at the Apologetics Empire, training or whatever, and we had some great conversations. So I'm just glad, to count you as a friend and be able to be on here and further that conversation. So yeah, I'm excited to be here, man. Thank you.
Oh yeah, brother, you're very welcome. Yeah, y'all, we won't get to talk about all the things we talked about, but I think started with philosophy and epistemology and rolled into all kinds of stuff.
We were everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah, we had all over the place. Yeah. I think 3 days to hang out and talk before I had to come home. And so, yeah, anyway, we wanted to bring some of that conversation to you guys because one of the conversations Adam and I had was about this topic. And so we'll sort of roll into it casually, but if you guys have questions for myself or Adam about the topic, please, oh, please put either a question or a Q and like a colon or semicolon, doesn't matter. I'm not picky, just so that we know. And then if you can, who it's directed at, either Adam, myself. If you don't tell us, it's okay. I'll feed it over to Adam and let him field the question. The only rule, and remember this, guys, well, not the only rule, but the main rule is this is an academic channel, which means I want you guys to start acting like scholars and not school children. Now, most of you already know that and already act that way. That means no name calling. No, please, no profanity. All right. Doesn't matter. Christian, atheist, doesn't matter. I don't care. Buddhist, agnostic. I don't care what your background is. Doesn't bother me one bit. I just want us all to behave like scholars. Don't attack somebody's character, their education, their background. None of that matters. What you want to look at is the argument itself. Address the argument. Don't belittle somebody or even the argument. That's really not going to help anything. Come with evidence. Think about what you're going to say. Always try to practice the principle of charity. Now, what that means is not I'm being nice, although that's a good thing. Yeah. But the principle of charity is assuming your interlocutor, the person you're talking with, is correct. Rather than trying to prove they're wrong, just assume they're wrong and try to prove that. Assume they're correct and try to tease out what it is they're saying by asking good questions. All right. So that's the background, basically. And again, if you have questions, Erica, Nate, the mods will gather those up, and at the end, they'll send them over to me, and then I'll toss them over to Adam. So if they don't get answered right away, don't worry. I have in the past missed questions, guys. I'm sorry about that. If I do miss your question, but you still want Adam to answer it, you can email me at sean@believingthinkers.com or hello@believingthinkers.com, and I'll be sure he gets the question. And maybe it's something you want him to answer, addressed to you privately. No problem. I'll get that over to him, and then he'll get back with you, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. If we don't get to a question, man, blame Nate. That's my recommendation. It's Nate 2D2's fault.
There you go. Blame Nate.
Blame Nate. I'm posting it on my website, on my Facebook right now, man, so people can join in.
Awesome. Thank you, brother. Yeah. So that's basically the background. Just so everybody knows, mods, feel free to moderate at your discretion. You guys know how we like things to go here, and we'll sort of roll from there. Now, the topic today is going to sort of roll into at some point a hot button issue, I think, right now in culture. And so please, guys, remember to be charitable in the sense that even if you disagree, that's fine. Disagreement doesn't bother us, but be thoughtful about how you're doing it. My advice is always ask questions first to be sure you even understand what the person, that you disagree with is saying. All right. We don't want to inadvertently straw man them. So I guess I'll start with this too, Adam, and feel free, guys. If we're looking down, we're probably using our phones to answer questions and check. So
sharing the video,
yeah, sharing the video and doing stuff. So we're not trying to be disrespectful to you all. And no, you're good, brother, because I'll do it too. At times, I'm going to be looking down at my phone. I don't want you guys to think I'm not interested in what Adam's saying. It's just that we're both used to run YouTube channels, and that's part of it.
Yeah.
So, what is exactly urban apologetics? Because I noticed that's something that you do on your channel.
Sure. Yeah. So, years ago, and maybe we can, get into this a little bit later, but I got into apologetics in general. It was introduced to it by my dad, actually. And it came at a time that it was very critical in my life, and maybe we can go further into that if you like.
Yeah.
But essentially, actually, I guess I can just kind of give a snippet version. Basically, I come out of the Word of Faith, sector of the church. And thank God that he brought me out of it. I thank God for that he corrected my doctrine and whatnot. And so I was kind of
going through What is it? Because I'm not familiar with Word of Faith. Could you give me
a wow. Okay. All right. Yeah. So you know what? It's true. Yeah. So I guess I just assume that people know what that is. But people like your Kenneth Copelands and Creflo Dollars and Benny Hinn's, where they believe that you can, speak things into existence if you have enough faith. And it really becomes a, God as a genie in the bottle type of prosperity gospel type of a thing. Those are the kind of churches that I came out of. And so, I thank God that he corrected my doctrine and brought me out of it. And as I'm in this transition phase, it's really just trying to understand scripture better. I'm married. I get married. We buy a new home. I get a new job, all within like a year and a half. All these good things are happening. Wow. And long story short, my wife is pregnant. And so we're excited about that as well. I'm getting ready to go on a mission trip. So everything, I'm just hitting on all cylinders, man. I'm like, man, I'm just really rolling. And, I go on this mission trip to Jamaica, had a powerful time there. And when I come back, my wife had a miscarriage. This is our first pregnancy. She has a miscarriage. And we were, just devastated. Both of us had saved ourselves to a marriage. We'd, done things, the right way, so to speak. And so we were just like, man, like how does this kind of thing happen? And this is the reason why I brought up the Word of Faith movement, because, when you're in a Word of Faith, it's like, if something like that goes wrong, then it's like either you didn't have enough faith or maybe you weren't tithing right. So you kind of going through this checklist of whatever you did wrong to not get God's blessing in that area. And so fortunately, I had already come out of that, and I was able to kind of, wrestle with it a better way, because about 5 months before my wife had the miscarriage, my dad had sent me like 5 apologetics books, On Guard by William Lane Craig, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, Norm Geisler and Frank Turek, another apologetics book by Norm Geisler, and there was like 2 others. I think John Lennox, one of John Lennox's books as well. And I'd been introduced to apologetics before because he previously sent me something from Robert Zacharias, but for whatever reason, when he sent me these books, I just like the light bulb went off. I was just eating. Every day I'm just eating this stuff up. I'm like, man, I didn't realize that there was this robust intellectual side to the biblical worldview. And so the thing about it is, it was crazy. And so this whole 5 month period before the miscarriage, I'm eating this stuff up and like kind of shoring up my faith, building up my confidence in God, so that when this tragedy happened, I had the resources and the foundation to be able to navigate it. And so that's why I'm so passionate about apologetics, because literally for myself, if it wasn't for that, if God hadn't, providently moved in that way, then I don't know where I would be right now. So, so I got that. So that's how I got into apologetics. And actually, real quick fun fact, interesting enough. So one of the books that my dad sent me was On Guard by William Lane Craig. And like I said, it really helped me to kind of navigate, dealing with the problem of evil and all those kind of things when we ran into that issue. And 2 years later, I guess it'd been about 3 years later, my wife and I, we'd had 2 of our kids. We now have 4, praise God for that. So we had 2 of our kids. And one of the high points in really my life is I had the opportunity to meet William Lane Craig, and he actually autographed one of his children's books that he's written, and he autographed it to my first 2 children that I had at that time. So it was just like a really cool kind of bow on that story, how God, used him in that time. And then, later on, just to kind of have that. I think that's actually the first time I've shared that publicly. I believe,
cool.
But yeah, so God used apologetics in my life, man. And I was, into really big fan of Ravi Zacharias, of course. I was listening to him like at one point, like 5 hours a day, on podcasts and whatnot, John Lennox, those guys. And so I'm listening to those guys, and, through Facebook and to some extent YouTube, I started coming across objections to the Christian faith that didn't fall within the pale of the kinds of things that a John Lennox would be faced with. And actually, interestingly enough, I never forget, there was this, in this one short period, maybe about a month or so, I was watching this a YouTube video with John Lennox, and he does his Q&A and stuff, and he's real sharp at it. And so there's no discredit to him whatsoever. But there was a gentleman who came up, who actually kind of looked like me, dreads, big, black guy, whatever, the scruffy beard and stuff. And he comes up and he asks John Lennox a question about, was Jesus derived from horse or something like that? And I can't remember how he framed it, but at the time, I was like, man, those are the kind of questions I'm seeing amongst my family, my friends, and on my timeline, and John Lennox did the best that he could with it, but it was just kind of out of his wheelhouse. And it just like really stuck out to me. And then a couple of weeks later, there was another apologist. I'm not going to say his name because I wouldn't want to take it the wrong way, but there was another apologist who was talking about, he was going to go to, he was planning a trip, I think it's to South Africa. And he was talking about the kinds of questions that he anticipated. Is Christianity the white man's religion? Does the Bible condone slavery? And a number of other things that are swirling about in the African-American context all the time. And he was talking about how he was going to address it. And as I was listening to him, I was like, man, that's a good answer. But, you might want to think about these other points too. I mean, there's these other aspects that would be helpful in answering these questions. And so I actually began to write this apologist a letter, an email. And I got about 75% of the way through the letter. And I said, you know what? Why don't I do it? Why don't I, start addressing these questions? I mean, this is something that I was grappling with myself. I began studying these things. And now, God has, answered a lot of my questions. Why don't I share it, and have a platform or something like that? And that's actually, one of the reasons why I ended up sparking the Tru-ID podcast, to address these kinds of questions. And so ultimately coming around to your question, in terms of urban apologetics, which is most commonly known as urban apologetics. And I often use the term culturally contextualized apologetics, is that you have a number of objections to and questions about Christianity that are gaining traction in the African-American context, and really the Africans in the diaspora, in the Western world more broadly, and also belief systems that are piggybacking off of those that need to be addressed. And so that's really kind of the bulk of what I do, at Tru-ID. And so, you have different groups like the Hebrew Israelites, who some people may have heard of. These are people of African descent who believe themselves to be the Hebrews that the Bible speaks of. You have groups like the Comedics, who base their spirituality around Egyptian philosophy, spirituality, and so forth. And you have Moors and Black atheists, who are just kind of garden variety atheists with a cultural twist a little bit. So, I mean, there's all those groups that have been unfortunately going unaddressed for quite some time. And now, people like myself, and I'm not the only one. I mean, there's others as well, like, Damon Richardson, Nefertiti, and my man, Alfredo Valentin, a bunch of folks that I can name who are taking this stuff by the horns, man, and really dealing with it. So yeah, that's kind of Tru-ID in a nutshell. But by the way, Tru-ID stands for the real you imago Dei, which means Latin for image of God. And so when I first started the show, one thing that I was realizing is that much of the, say, Afrocentric or ethnocentric kind of alternative religions that were bucking against the church, if you will, they really revolved around this identity issue, this notion that, okay, well, we need to cast off anything that's considered to be European, take on whatever's considered to be African or indigenous, and in that balance, you will Christianity is seen as being on the wrong side of the equation, and so therefore you have people casting off Christianity and taking on what they believe to be more in line with their indigenous heritage. And so my whole thing was, the identity piece was right there front and center. And I'm like, what we need to do is understand the foundation of who we are as being made in the image of God. That's the foundation. Like that. And we can take it further than that. But yeah,
I like that, because then your identity is not in the pigmentation in your skin; it's in being created in the image of God.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. One thing I say all the time is that we have to be careful not to take a feature of who you are and make it the foundation of who you are.
Oh, I like that.
The foundation of who we are is that we are made in the image of God. God took himself as the blueprint, created us, and, once you take a feature, whether it be an ethnic feature, a nationalistic feature, any subculture you want to name, and kind of make that the foundation, then that feature becomes an idol and in a way, a barrier to living out life as we were created to live it.
Yeah, that's awesome. It sounds like you and I have a lot more in common. I won't get into all that because this is your interview right now. But
okay, no, it's whatever. Yeah.
But yeah, we've got. I mean, everything from Eric and I experienced miscarriage, the first child, and then had Brandon, and a lot of similarities there. Mm-hmm. And not to mention, same thing was that we were sort of, I mean, I pastored for many years, but we were really introduced to apologetics in the, in the sense of how you and I do it online now by Dr. Zacharias, which led to William Lane Craig, which sort of led to this deep desire to want to understand philosophy and logic better and all of the subdisciplines. But I noticed the same thing, was that people either weren't understanding what these apologists were saying because they didn't have these foundational things. And I went, oh, wait a minute. These guys are all talking, these simple things that they're saying, they're taking for granted that everyone's had some sort of basic education in logic or philosophy.
Sure.
And so these folks are missing the point. Or same thing is, I'm not getting the same questions that they're answering. And I'm thinking, this isn't the same. This isn't what concerns people, at least not that they're wrong. It just wasn't my reality. It wasn't what I was experiencing.
You're encountering, right. Exactly.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so,
matter of fact, the first, I mentioned this on my channel the other day, the first apologetics event that I ever attended in person was an RZIM event, Ravi Zacharias Ministries. Yeah. And it's funny because I was a fan of Alistair McGrath, right? Mm-hmm. And so I go to this event, and the spokespersons, the speakers that night was supposed to be Stuart McAllister and Andy Bannister. And I had my Alistairs mixed up because I'm picturing Alistair McGrath. And so when I get to this event, I mean, I'm excited, man. It's my first event. I'm the first one in the door. I'm ready to go. And Stuart McAllister, he was there actually, before everything was kicking off. And so he comes up to me and we're talking a little bit. And I'm like, yeah, man, I'm just getting into apologetics and I can't wait to see Stuart McAllister, man. It's going to be awesome. And he gives me this weird look. He's like, okay. And then we just kind of keep on talking. I didn't realize that he was Stuart McAllister that I was talking to until, the event started and he introduced himself. I was like, oh man, I feel stupid now, but, so afterwards, I mean, he was real cool about it. And, we were talking a little bit about it afterwards. And I was just like, man, what do I need to do to be an apologist? Should I get my degree in this or get a doctorate? And he was like, look, man, listen, just bloom where you're planted. That's what he told me, bloom where you're planted. And I did. That's what I ended up doing, so to your point, I mean, we all find ourselves, I believe, by God's, sovereignty in different contexts. And so we have to, seek God in terms of like, what do you have for me to do? I can't be Ravi Zacharias. There's only one of those.
Right.
But I can be Adam Coleman and address the kinds of things that God sets before me to address. And so that's kind of how I approach it.
That's good, brother. And that's something I had to learn. It's a lesson I had to learn the hard way, was trying to seeing whether it was music or whatever I was doing, seeing what others were doing and going, I like that. So naturally I want to do that. And then not realizing that's not the way God made me. And so I don't have those gifts. And even though I want to do it, but then I had to learn, no, you got to do what it's going to be a lot easier if I rely on the gifts I have and do that and follow that path than it will be. Maybe I could do those things, but you know what I mean? It's difficult.
Yeah.
That's awesome, brother. So with culturally contextualized apologetics, what sorts of things are you finding are important, I guess, for people to hear and understand in that context, if that makes sense?
Yeah, sure. So there's a number of things. Again, it typically revolves around this identity piece, you know. So now, I'm a Alvin Flanagan fan, so I often, allude to him in what I'm sharing. But one thing I like about, or that I glean from him, is making a distinction between de jure objections and de facto objections, right? And so for the most part, and I'm trying to say this carefully because I'm actually working through some own thinking, but for the most part, the most potent objections to Christianity in African American context tend to be the de jure objections. Now, I probably should spell out what that means. So de facto objections are something to do with whether or not something is factually true, and put it that way. Right. So if somebody says Jesus didn't exist, or God doesn't exist, I mean, those are things either it's true or it's false. Either it's factually true or it's false. De jure objections would be something where there's something about a belief or about something or whatever that's in some sense intolerable. There's some other quality of it beyond whether it's true or not for which we should reject it. So either it's immoral or it's irrational, or there's a number of other things that actually plenty of focuses on whether something's rational or not. And if Christianity is irrational, then that's perhaps is grounds for rejecting it. But in our context, I think it's that the notion that Christianity is immoral in a specific sense that people in our context associate it with oppression and racism and things of that nature, because you do have, unfortunately, a number of folks who profess to be Christians involved in the transatlantic slave trade, involved in slavery in the antebellum South, or oppression throughout protracted oppression throughout America's history and history in the West. And so, when you have the dominant culture asserting that there's this Christian underpinning in their culture, and then at the same time you have these evils and so on and so forth also being perpetrated on other folks, by the same group, then unfortunately Christianity becomes guilty by association. Yeah. Right. So you have questions like, well, like, why is Christianity, where was Jesus during slavery, for example, or something like that, or our Christianity was beaten into our ancestors. I mean, that's a popular one, and all those kinds of things. So it's basically unpalatable, if you will, right? And that sort of thing. Yeah. So we get those questions all the time, and now it's not to say that people don't raise de facto objections, like is Jesus based upon Horus, or they'll say, Jesus never exists, things like that. It's not to say that we don't get those, but I think the most potent ones tend to be de jure. Now, with that being said, I don't want to make light of it in this specific sense, because if it were the case that Christianity militated against one's humanity, if that were true, then that might be indicative that it is not some sort of divine truth, right? You would think that there is a red flag there if it is indeed the case that Christianity is militates against the humanity of African persons. So I think you do have this sense that this de jure objection is grounded in some sort of legitimate ontological concern. Fortunately, that's not the case. Fortunately, we were made in God's image, and there's really good reasons to affirm that Christianity is not, nor has it ever been, anti-African or anti-whatever ethnicity. And so we can really cut through those kinds of objections. Yeah. Yeah.
So even if, just as a real potent example, and I don't mean to be insensitive to anyone here at all, is that unfortunately were some white slave owners that tried to manipulate passages, whether it's in Philemon or wherever, to try to make a case for slavery through the Bible. Now, they were wrong, but they tried to do it that way. And that damaged Christianity in that sense. But of course not. You've got a lot of pastors and preachers, they were abolitionists, thank God, that stood out and said, no, that's not what the Bible's saying. That was not prescriptive. It was descriptive when Paul wrote those things. So
right. Yeah. Well, perfect example. So, I like to put it this way. So I live in Virginia, and I use this analogy all the time. A couple of years ago, we had the Charlottesville march where that turned violent, unfortunately. And, unfortunately, a young woman was killed. I think she was ran over by a Dodge Viper, which is terrible. Now, one thing I say all the time is that when that happened, nobody went out and protested Dodge. You know what I'm saying? Nobody went to the Dodge factories and said, hey, this thing killed somebody and we need to get rid of them. Why? Because people understand that the murderer in that case used the Dodge Viper for a purpose for which it was not intended. Right. And so in the same way, it's just like that with Christianity. Yes, it is the case that you have some depraved individuals who attempted to use Christianity for a purpose for which it was not intended. But that's not a statement of Christianity itself or about Christianity itself. That's a statement about those depraved individuals and sin working in their hearts, right? And so you do have, actually, in the Smithsonian right now, there's what was called the Slave Bible. And the Slave Bible was the Bible that enslavers would, give to some of the slave preachers, or even, they would utilize when not ministering, but so-called preaching to, slave persons. They actually had a Slave Bible where you have this Bible with all the passages removed about equality between persons, about the slaves and the Exodus being freed. Anything that had to do with slaves being freed or equality, they removed those passages, and then they would give that to the enslaved persons to work with. And so obviously these individuals were not about the gospel. Obviously, these people were not about God's truth. And the fact of the matter is this: what a lot of people don't realize is that, and I usually address this in context of talking about this false idea that the only scenario by which enslaved persons encountered Christianity was by a bull with it being beaten into them. The fact of the matter is, for a large portion of the transatlantic slave trade, you actually have slave masters opposing the preaching of the gospel to the slaves. Because during the colonial period here in America, obviously the American colonies were colonies of England and under English common law. And under English common law, it was illegal to own a Christian as a slave. And so you actually do have a minority of African enslaved persons who entered into slavery here in the West, already having encountered Christianity and confirming themselves as being Christians, because the Portuguese encountered the Congo in 1491, and Christianity spread there to some extent at that point. And so some people entering into the transatlantic slave trade as enslaved persons already consider themselves to be Christians. And then you had others who encountered Christianity here in the West and, saw, latched into the gospel, got baptized, became Christian themselves. And so then you created this dilemma, like, you're not supposed to own a Christian as a slave, but here you have this African enslaved person who's saying that they're a Christian. So what do you do? And so that created a legal dilemma that many slave owners say, okay, well, here's how we're going to solve that. If my slaves don't get preached to, then they won't get saved. If they don't get saved, I don't have to set them free. And so you actually do have a significant number of slave owners who oppose the preaching of the gospel to enslaved persons on that basis. And so, it's there's so many misconceptions about the interaction between African enslaved persons and Christianity that need to be cleared up. But it's these misconceptions that add fuel to the fire of individuals today who reject Christianity on those grounds.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. And from my limited memory and study in this field was that I remember there were Christian missionaries, and that may be who I may be thinking of the same one. I can't remember his name right now, that went to Africa trying to help stop the slave trade. And around that time, the 1400s, maybe later than that. If one of our viewers remembers who I'm talking about, you guys can put the name of I want to say in English, I think he was a missionary originally. And of course he notes that and this is just a matter of fact, I'm not picking on Islam here, guys, but that the Muslims in the North were in fact capturing these black men in the South and women, capturing them, enslaving them and selling them off. Now that's not relinquishing blame for those who are purchasing them. They're just as much to blame. Yeah. So I'm not trying to, relieve the guilt there of those individuals at all. Nor am I trying to throw Islam under the bus here. Actually, that's not what I'm just simply trying to paint a sort of picture.
Yeah, here. Facts are facts, right?
Right.
And you're right. So when it comes to the transatlantic slave trade, by and large, you don't have this picture of Europeans invading Africa and all this kind of thing and just scooping people up. Now, there are instances in which you do have people being tricked into slave boats and things. Sure. It's not to say that didn't happen, but by and large, the slave trade in West Africa was going on for centuries prior to Europeans coming into the picture. That's just a historical fact. And so, and people can look at, say, for example, the works of Olaudah Equiano, who was an abolitionist. He's an African-born person who became enslaved and eventually was freed, and he went on to become an abolitionist. He was in direct contact with William Wilberforce and some other gentlemen, Josiah Hedgewood and some other Wedgwood rather, and who were pivotal in terms of getting the transatlantic slave trade shut down. But in a lot of Equiano's work, he talks about how he was captured by Africans and sold amongst various different tribes over there in West Africa, and then eventually sold to Europeans. And that was the experience of many folks. You would have enslavers, African enslavers, go kidnap people, particularly from the interior, and they would march them down to the coast where they would then sell them to Europeans. And some estimates I've seen is that you had maybe 30 million Africans died just on the march from the interior to the coast. So it was a pretty heinous practice all around the board, and with everybody involved, sharing guilt in that regard. And then of course, folks would be sold over to Europeans in the West, and then their trials will continue. But you have lots of different folks involved, which is why, again, it's so important, I think, that we focus on our identity being grounded in the Imago Dei, because if I'm gonna prop up my identity on being Black or being African, if that's going to be the source of my self-esteem, for example, then I've got to deal with those skeletons in the closet too. You know what I'm saying? But for me, my foundation is the Imago Dei, and I can look at my ethnic heritage and look at whatever is in alignment with the way that God created things to be, and take joy in those things. And whatever doesn't, I just recognize that that's part of depraved man. You know what I'm saying? And I don't have to have that reflected upon how I see myself. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
So, and that's why it's so important that everybody, have, their identity, propped up by the right thing. You know what I'm saying?
That's excellent. In fact, we had talked about this. I'm working on some material for Christians, 2 things, anger management stuff, actually to be incorporated in some things, but then also how we can exemplify the fruit of the Spirit. And one of the things in both cases is detachment. And in other words, in anger, it's detaching myself from the things that I try to make part of my identity, because I see value in those things. It doesn't mean I can't be proud to be whatever that thing is, a musician, a dad, whatever. But if I attach it in the wrong way and develop my identity there, whenever somebody attacks that, I'm going to get angry real quick. Now, that's not to say that racism you shouldn't be upset about. That's a different thing entirely. I want to draw a distinction there.
Well, yeah, I mean, it kind of, to add a different nuance, I think, that goes to your point. Now, I will say this: one of the, well, maybe I won't call it a mistake, but I guess one of the nuances that I hadn't taken into account when I initially started was, I'm dealing with these Afrocentric, ethnocentric groups, and I'm addressing the Imago Dei and applying it to these worldviews and trying to demonstrate to folks how the image of God is a better foundation, and that was kind of where I was at. But at the same time, I mean, you know that as philosophers, as apologists, whatever, we want to be consistent. If what I'm saying is true, then I ought to be able to consistently apply it across the board, right? Yep. And so as I began to engage folks on, dealing with slavery and all these kinds of things, what I began to realize is, and forgive me, but I have to be explicit because it just, the point loses steam if I'm not, but engaging people who are just who prop themselves up on their national history, here in America, you know what I'm saying? Or, those who are Caucasians, who prop themselves up, with their ethnic history or ethnic image, heritage in the same way that some people from African descent do. Anytime you've got those things out of step, it's going to cause problems. And so, when you have somebody like myself, I'm dealing with the realities of American history. Here's the thing: in the African American context, right? They're going to grapple with the problem of evil just like everybody else. That's an existential problem that everybody's going to grapple with. Right. But in the African American context, there's an intersection between the problem of evil and racism and oppression here in America. And so you can't properly deal with the problem of evil in our context without addressing those very real sufferings and so forth. But the problem is, when you address those things, some people are very uncomfortable with that. they're very, because they've really bought into a particular understanding of what they believe America to be. And I'm like, look, America is, I'm glad I live here. I wouldn't want to live anywhere else. I mean, all those things are true, but at the same time, depraved people live in America just like they do everywhere else.
Yeah,
right.
That's true.
And so you have to deal with slavery. You have to deal with the realities of that. You have to deal with the realities of racism, past, present, and past and present. And when you do that, I've encountered that there are some individuals who are super patriots here in America, or maybe to be explicit, Caucasians who haven't properly subjected their ethnic identity to the cross, and they do get upset. They do get angry because they feel like I'm coming at them. And that's just not the case. Like, what I'm coming at is the deceptions that unfortunately the enemy has used to divide the church along racial lines, and thus disrupt the godly fellowship for which the New Testament church has been apportioned to. So, yeah.
Which beautiful segue, because that brings me to a question I've been wanting to ask you. And we talked about this a little bit, and there may not be an easy answer either, but I'm willing to ask the question, which is
probably not. So that's why you're throwing the question to me, right?
yeah. Let me pass this.
Clown around with it.
Right. I don't have the answer. Here you go. You're the expert.
Right.
So there's two parts to it, and no answer is going to offend me at all. I'm open enough to hear feedback on this. So the first part is, as a Caucasian man, what can I do, and a Christian, what can I do, first of all, in my own life to help? And secondly, and the second part to that is culturally, in the sense that, and I'll bring the second part question up again, because it's going to be hard to remember all this as I tease it out, but would be, if I'm working with a friend who's African-American and he has these issues, how is that going to come across if I'm trying to help him with it? Is it going to come across that I'm biased? You know what I mean? And how should I approach that? Because I want to be there to help him with the cross and those issues, but I don't want to do it in a way that is harmful, if that makes sense. I want to be mindful of that.
Sure. Well, I think that you're right. There is no easy answer to that. The only thing I can do is be honest. And so I remember a couple of years ago, and this is, I don't bring this up to be political. Just kind of hear the analogy. I'm not saying to the audience, just hear out the analogy, and then hopefully you'll see where I'm coming from. So I remember a couple of years ago, there was a Black History Month celebration or proceeding somewhere at the White House, and Donald Trump made mention of Frederick Douglass, and I can't remember what he said, but he phrased it in a way that almost seemed like he still believed that Frederick Douglass was alive. Like, he referred to him as almost like a contemporary,
Right.
And everybody was joking on Trump for it, and he caught a lot of flack in the media. And now what I thought about was this: is that, now this is no disrespect to anybody, but I want to say that Trump is probably in the 70s or something like that, or whatever. Now, for somebody like Donald Trump, how much Black history did he get when he was in school? Probably not a whole lot. I mean, you're going back to, a good little ways there. Black History Month wasn't really started until like 1972, 76, something like that. And prior, you had Black History Week. But, during the time when he was in school, even if they did, I mean, they weren't learning Black history in school. And some of the events that have been pivotal, to, so-called Black history, I mean, he lived through some of it, you know what I'm saying? So, but anyway, my point is that there's a lot that he probably doesn't know about Black history. And if you don't know the history of a people, then to some extent, it's really kind of hard to know that people, you know what I'm saying? And so here's where I'm going with it. I think that in America in general, there's this presumption that we know each other. But the reality is probably something different. I kind of liken it where, the Black community I'll come back to this later. I mean, but, just for practical purposes, the Black community and the white community is kind of like two people sitting at the same dinner table on their cell phones. They're together, but they're still not, connected in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I got you.
Now I do think there's been some great improvements over time. Obviously, we don't have slavery still going on today, and Jim Crow is legally speaking, not in the picture. So I mean, I'm not saying that there hasn't been progress made, but I'm saying that there is still progress to be made. Yeah. And so when you think about even coming around to the church, when you think about like segregation, right? And the impact that it's had. I mean, legally speaking, you have two people groups that were set apart from one another, right? Now, the church is is a people that ought to transcend these racial distinctions that we see in the world, right? But legally speaking, believers have been separated by these institutions and segregation and so on and so forth. Because when you think about where you fellowship, I mean, you're probably going to fellowship, for the most part, somewhere that's in close proximity to you, and you're going to fellowship with people that are in your vicinity. And so to some extent, the church, the fellowship amongst believers has been disrupted by these things from the world, right? Yep. So now what is that? So what do we do with that? I mean, Paul talks about we ought not to be ignorant of the enemy's devices. We need to be aware of that. And I consider myself to be a radical reconciliationist. I believe that we need to take very tangible steps to undo these elements of sin and culture that unfortunately infected the church in terms of the way that we fellowship with one another. Now, when you do that, then what happens is we're no longer communicating from across a football field, but we can be up close and personal and really get at the truth about culture and society and what's going on, such that we can bear one another's burdens. And I think there has to be that fellowship. I'm saying that there's one, Lord, one faith, one baptism. I mean, that's the overarching, that bond of peace that we have. And that bond of peace then puts us in a position to where we can deal with difficult issues from a truthful standpoint. There are some things that I get it. I mean, there's some things that I have to say that I know that some folks don't want to hear. I get that. You know what I'm saying? But it's easier to grapple with it when we're in fellowship with one another and we have that mutual trust flowing from the cross, and then we can engage one another from a position of truth. And so I think that in terms of what folks like yourself can do to help is we've got to get in proximity with one another, and there has to be a truth sharing. There's got to be hey, this is what I'm seeing, and I'm like, hey, okay, well, this is what I'm seeing, and then we wrestle with it, to where we can come to a knowledge of the truth, and then proceed from there. I think there has to be that.
That's interesting, yeah, and it's funny because to me, on the one hand, I grew up in South Florida, so I was actually a minority at a school I went to. I was called cracker more than a box of saltines, and it don't bother me. I mean, it does not bother me at all. And the other thing that it's funny to me is that people tend to see things as just black and white. And here, I mean, literally, skin color as well.
Sure, I got you. Yeah.
And to me, even within the Caucasian group, if you will, I don't identify with Italians as well as I do with other Scots. Why? Because I know my heritage is Scottish, English. It goes way back because my grandfather had done a bunch of history. He just was fascinated by it. He's stationed over in England during World War II, flying bombers over in Europe. He flew on D-Day. It's crazy anyway. So that piqued his interest. So when he got back, he was doing all this research, handed that over. I ended up with these volumes full of our family history. So it was interesting because it made sense to me. Not that I don't like Italian Americans, but when I'm looking at all this, and starting to see all that, and I go, "Oh, okay, that's why."
Cool, yeah.
There's just differences. I mean, to me, now, granted, understandably, other people that are outside of my ethnic worldview don't see that. They just see, you put me next to an Italian guy, and they don't see a difference, and that's fine. That doesn't bother me at all, one bit. As long as they're willing to do exactly what you're talking about, is to take anything I'm saying seriously, but not authoritatively so, in the sense that, whatever I say is gospel. That's not what I'm asking for. Just in the sense, like you said, that we're seeking truth and that we're willing to listen to one another.
Well, so, I mean, and I think we've got to be as biblical as we can, because, I mean, number one of my pet peeves is that you do have some who, take it that the cross eradicates differences, you know what I'm saying, which is not true. That's really not true. I mean, there's nothing wrong with, so put it this way, diversity is not the same as division. You know what I'm saying? And what I'm saying, distinctions are not the same as division. And so I think sometimes, so for example, I can't tell you how many times people have quoted, well, there's neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek, slave nor free. I was like, okay, well, if you take that passage to be something that eradicates ethnic distinctions, then you'd have to say that Paul was a New Testament transgenderist, because it said there's neither male nor female. Right, now, I don't think that Paul was promoting transgenderism in Christ, right? Yeah. Obviously that's not the case. And Paul himself, he said, "Look, I would rather be accursed for my brethren in the flesh." So him as a New Testament believer still, acknowledged that there was this ethnic heritage and lineage that he was part of. in the Old Testament, you had, the Hebrews as far as the Israelites as a nation, but there were also different tribes, and Paul took great care to acknowledge that. He said, I was of the tribe of Benjamin. I was a Jew's Jew. You know what I'm saying? And so there's nothing wrong with acknowledging, our differences and distinctions. Actually, I think is a part of God, of the Imago Dei. I think it's a part of God being an artist. You know what I'm saying? Like there's this beautiful diversity that if we're functioning as we ought to, it should be this beautiful mosaic of humanity. And I think that should be most expressed right now in the church, right? Yeah. And so when we try to eradicate all differences, then I think we end up doing a disservice to something that God really has done. Now, as far as racial categories specifically, obviously that's something that's, you don't really see, well, in many ways man-made. And we, probably, I don't want to go too far afield with that, but my whole point is, cultural distinctions and so on and so forth, even if it's in some way tied to, even physical distinctions, that in and of itself is not a problem. The problem is when you take those features and make them the foundation, or take them and militate against people who have different features and so forth. That's where you begin to step in beyond just diversity and move into being divisive. And we had to be very careful to make those distinctions. And so I think that, now, with that being said, we do have different cultural experiences, and I think that's something else that has to be, it doesn't just it's not reducible to color and bone structure or something like that. We have different cultural experiences. And so, and sometimes those cultural experiences butt heads. And that's when I think the cross is able to give us a platform by which we can, hash these things out. So I'm being abstract, but to be more specific, when you have a situation like the Arbery case, or with Botham Jean, with Geiger, that police officer Geiger, or different police shootings and things like that, in addition to being a Christian, we're all going to assess those incidences from our realm of experience. I mean, that's part of epistemology. You know what I'm saying? We all have freight that we bring into any given situation, and it impacts how we adjudicate, the truth of something or the falsity of something. Yeah. So, we have to be aware of those things and kind of use one another, iron sharpen iron, to tease out where we can kind of, shave off those aspects of our experiences that are maybe skewing how we view things in a particular way, and then ultimately come to the truth. But, when I, see incidences like those kind of things, I immediately think about the time where I was harassed by a police officer, or the time when, my brother-in-law was pulled over by a police officer, and the first question the officer asked him was, "Have you paid your child support lately?" Right. Yeah. I mean, exactly. Right. I mean, it sounds crazy, but when you grow up in a context where those things are a constant reality, and when your personal experience, you see something within your own experience that seems to connect with what you're seeing on the news at night, then that's gonna, in some sense, it's going to make it easier for me to conclude that, there's something nefarious going on with the situation, where somebody else might think, well, no, we live in a post-racial America, and, that we don't see those things now. See, you know what I'm saying? Those things really, now that's not to make my experience infallible, or to give me some sort of infallibility because of my experience, but it does give me a perspective that, ultimately amongst Christians, we ought to be able to hash those things out and together, come to a knowledge of the truth, even in things that are happening right now.
Yeah. And I get it. People won't sound like me trying to compare stories and one up you. That's not it at all. With, as a martial artist, I know you have a background as well in martial arts. Your father taught. Yeah.
Yeah, he did. Yeah, that's what he did.
So you this will sound familiar, I'm sure, but I've had people as an instructor, school owner. I mean, I've, done it for years now. And I'd have people come in and look at me, and I'm teaching a Filipino martial art. And they say, well, I'm going to go train with Bob Smith. That's not his name, down the street, who's Filipino. Now I'm thinking in my head, I know Bob Smith. The guy's not very good at what he's doing, but I don't want to say that. I mean, he's not, but he doesn't, to an extent, doesn't try to say he is better. That's not the issue. Mm-hmm. And I say, oh, hey, man, have at it. Now, up to this point, I'm fine with that. That doesn't matter, right?
Yeah.
Because okay. But when they say, I mean, literally, I've had people tell me this, because you're not Filipino, or you're not Asian, or you're not this, you can't be as good of a teacher. Mm-hmm. And I'm going, well, wait a minute. Look at all the medals there that we've won at the tournaments. Look at all the fights we've been in. Look at all the, all this experience. Look at the time and grade. Yeah. That's what I want you to look at, not the color of my skin, and determine whether or not I'm good based on that. And so in that sense, I see it. So some of that I think is people being people, if that makes sense, for better or worse.
Sure.
And I'm curious about this because when I hear stories like what you're telling me, these experiences, I think I didn't realize it's that bad, because it sounds like
it's pretty bad.
And do you think it's?
I mean, it's real, man. It's
real.
Real.
Do you think it's somebody wanting to be nasty and looking for a way to be nasty to somebody else, or do you think it's genuinely, if that makes a difference between that versus a deep-seated actual fabric of racism? Does that make sense to distinguish?
Yeah. So I think that there can be sometimes, a single thing can have, say, multiple causes, right? Let's say, for example, if you have an explosion, it could have been caused by, some gasoline and a piece of dynamite.
A
lit piece of dynamite, right? So you got these multiple causes that give rise to a particular effect. And so that's how I kind of look at it when it comes to, these kinds of instances. There can be multiple causes, of which, race can be one. So let me be more explicit. So let's say that, just talking about policing, for example, now, you're a military guy. So you understand that in the military, there is a necessary us versus them mentality that you have to develop. You can't function as a unit, what I'm saying, and not have that. That's just a reality of war. You know what I'm saying? There's the good guys and the bad guys. That's what it is. And one thing I tell people all the time, I can tell, I work with veterans myself. And so I can tell what era you served in based upon the terminology that you use to describe your combatants. If you use a term like insurgent, then I know that you're probably coming from, somewhere, you probably served in the Middle East, more recently, probably even after, probably, 9/11 and onward, probably. I'm saying, if you use the term, ragheads, I know what that means. Or if you're an older veteran, and I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. I'm not wincing at you. I'm thinking trying to do that. I'm going, but they do it.
And I hate to be explicit, but I just want to drive it home. But if somebody refers to, dragon ladies and gooks, I'm saying, or they, or Japs, I'm saying, like, I can tell what era of, the military you served in based upon the derogatory term that you use for your combatants. Now, why do people do that? Because it's very difficult, for the average human being to take a life of somebody else unless they create some sort of distance between themselves and that person. I got you. They've got to dehumanize them in some sort of a way. It's very difficult not to do that. You know what I'm saying? And we even talk about moral injury, amongst people in the military, where having to take a life and grapple with that, it's very difficult to do that unless you create some distance between us and them. Now, I bring that to the police because they're in a similar position, right? There's the police, and then you got perps. I'm saying, for lack of a better way to put it, right?
Yeah.
So they've got to have this, blue line, is ride or die, us together mentality. Now, when you have that coupled with, in some instances, individuals who are racist, there's racists everywhere. I mean, this is the reality of the matter. No matter what field you're in, there are some people who are depraved, who are sinful. And their particular sin of inclination is partiality in the form of racism. That's just mankind. That's biblical, right?
Right.
There's sin everywhere. Anyway, so when you have this us against them mentality coupled with somebody who's coming from that vantage point, then bad things are going to happen. Bad things are going to happen. Now, with me specifically, long story short, I was driving along. I was coming from a job interview, as a matter of fact, and I was heading back to a friend's house. So I was staying there that night because I was out of town. So I'm coming from this job interview, and I'm following behind him to get to his house, and I ran a yield sign. Ran the yield sign. I see the blue lights come on. I know I ran the yield sign. I mean, I'm not even tripping. It's like, you know what? You got me. I'm not even. Right. I was always taught by my parents, when you get pulled over, hands on the wheel. Yes, sir. No, sir. Yes, ma'am. No, ma'am. Always be respectful. That, you're always taught that, what I'm saying? Because you want to make it out of these encounters alive. So, so that's what I did. I got my hands on the wheel. He pulls me over. And it was kind of weird. He came along the passenger side of the car, which I'd never seen anybody do that before.
Yeah.
But you don't really come to the driver's side. So he went around the passenger side first, and he asked, the typical question, do you know why I pulled you over? And so he asked me, I said, well, officer, yeah. And like before I even finished the sentence, he said, don't cut me off while I'm talking. I mean, he just goes from 0 to 10, like just off the bat. Now, mind you, this is at night in an area called Newport News out here in Virginia that wasn't all that great. It wasn't a nice area, you know what I'm saying?
Right.
And so Anyway, so anyway, I know what it is. I'm like, all right, I know what it is. Hands on the wheel. I'm just gonna play it calm. Right. He has a weapon. I'm not trying to antagonize him at all. And so he takes his time writing the ticket and all this kind of stuff. He asks me, will you step out of the car? I'm like, okay. Can I pat you down for weapons? All right. I'm just kind of playing along. Right. And, do you have any weapons on you? No, officer, that kind of thing. And so then what's interesting is that he turns his back to me and he begins to walk towards his car and asks me to follow him to his car. So he turns his back and he starts walking to his car. Now I'm thinking like, okay, look, I have an undergrad in criminal justice. I'm saying I was going to be a police officer myself. If you really believe that I was a threat, you're not going to turn your back to me.
Right, right, exactly.
There's no way you're going to do that. Number one. Number two, you would have called for at least one or two other squad cars to give you some backup. I'm saying that's number two, because I had a friend of mine who had pulled over as well. He was kind of off in the distance. There's no way in the world, if you really believe I'm a threat and I could possibly have weapons, that you're going to turn your back to me. You're not going to call for backup. So that's not what this is right now. What this is a power play. You just want to be ignorant about it. And apparently this individual had some issues in the past. And so long story short, fortunately nothing came of it, but he was just as nasty as he could possibly be. And I wouldn't give him anything to bite on. I stayed calm the whole time. And fortunately I made it out. Other people, it doesn't go as well. You know what I'm saying? Other people, incidences get a little heated. And the thing is, I don't mean to be long with it, so I'll kind of move this along. You're good. What happens is when you have incidences where you've been disrespected by the police, or when they seem to exert their power in ways that they don't necessarily have to for whatever reason, or when they're being outright disrespectful, like asking my brother-in-law, "When have you paid your child support lately?" Mind you, he doesn't have any. He's just now having a child, and he just got married a couple months ago, so he didn't have any children, at the time.
Right.
When you grow up hearing things like that. And when you've seen, African Americans actually seen them getting pushed around by police, then you're gonna have a view that's you're not gonna be as trustful. And so it's more plausible then to me when I see any given incident of police misconduct or conduct by citizens. It's more plausible to me that these negative things can happen than somebody else who may not have witnessed those things, because I've got this background knowledge that I'm coming to the table with. It's like, what? It's not far-fetched, that this negative thing, happened to this individual partly because of race. So I know there's a way longer answer than
that's good, because it's funny, in my teen years, and I'll be short with this too, I was treated very badly. Now I have friends now, they're in law enforcement. A lot of guys I've trained over the years. I've done some loss prevention work, which isn't really law enforcement, but apprehending shoplifters and whatnot over the years. And so I have nothing against law enforcement, but I've been very badly mistreated, very badly mistreated by police when I was young. I don't know if it was the discrepancy there was I was young and they thought, I had a cop, first time I ever got a ticket. I'm pulled over on the way home from picking up the car that my dad just got, that it got repaired for me to drive. It's a Camaro. This female cop pulls me over. No, can tell I don't even look old enough to drive, Adam. I guarantee that. And I'm 16, 17 years old. And he didn't renew the plate because it was in the shop. We said, don't worry about it. Just drive it home. You're driving from the shop. It's no big deal. Or the plate didn't match the vehicle. I don't remember what happened. Something he was like, yeah, don't worry about it. Well, of course, worry about it. I'm literally a block from home and I get pulled over by this female officer and she's harassed. She is just, and she knows I'm young and dumb and don't know any better. And so at one point she hands me a ticket for this. I'm like, how do I, stupidly naive, how do I pay for this? Do I pay you now? Of course, are you trying to bribe me and hand on the weapon and everything? I'm like, are you stupid? Now at this point, I want to say, are you stupid? Like, really? Right. But I realized looking back on it, I'm pretty sure she wasn't that dumb. She was doing it intentionally to mess with me. Uh-oh, I just froze there.
Yeah, you're frozen on my end,
Yeah, well, it'll be all right. I'm not that important anyway.
But if you don't mind, while I share that, I'm sorry. Well, and that's what makes it difficult is that, for somebody like myself, now you do have some people who are, say unsaved or just maybe not, God hasn't worked on a particular area to where they take this history of protracted racism over time and it becomes bitterness for them. That's a reality for some people, but then you have, that's not everybody, you know what I'm saying? So for somebody like myself, and I'm kind of bringing it around to apologetics. So for somebody like myself, right. I don't want to deal with racism, on society. I don't want there to be racism in the world. But like, what do you do when you have groups of people saying that, it's not that serious today, racism isn't real, But then you have Amber Geiger, where we have the text messages, we have text messages that came out in court where she's making disparaging remarks about the death of Martin Luther King and talking about fellow Black officers and things like that. And then you're like, well, yeah, I don't want to think that this is going on. But then, this stuff keeps popping up. Or, when you have Ronald Reagan, who, a couple months ago, there was tapes released from him, where you have him on tape, talking to Richard Nixon, referring to Africans as monkeys and, saying things like they just got comfortable wearing shoes. That was Ronald Reagan.
Oh, my goodness.
I mean, it's in the National Archives. This is not like a hoax type of a thing. You see what I'm saying? So when you see things like that, or when you have whether it be Rodney King or O.J. Simpson. No, the reason why O.J. Simpson got off, people don't like to talk about it, is because Mark Furman was a racist. He was a documented racist, and they created enough reasonable doubt in terms of O.J.'s case that helped O.J. get off. I mean, so when you see things like when you want to believe better about the way society is, but you keep seeing this same aspect of man's depravity propping up, it becomes difficult, to turn a blind eye to it. So now for me, as somebody who's dealing with Hebrew Israelites and dealing with Muslims and Comedics, and they're all, looking at the same history, and they look to the Christian, like, well, what does the biblical worldview have to offer in face of these things? I think part of apologetics in our context is providing a moral framework, and demonstrating how that moral framework is effective in navigating these kinds of issues. You see what I'm saying? So God is a God of mercy, and he's a God of justice. He's a God of love and compassion, but he's also a God of righteousness. And being able to exemplify those things within the context of this society, I think, is paramount in terms of providing a solid apologetic within the African-American context. So, when situations like, things hit the news, like recently, I feel, compelled to respond to it, because I want to say, hey, here's the biblical worldview. Here's how I take the foundation of the Imago Dei and apply it to this situation. Or here's how I take what the Bible refers to as justice and apply it to this situation, in demonstrating that the biblical worldview is not impotent when it comes to navigating this aspect of the problem of suffering.
That's good. And one last question, then we'll take a few questions. I know we don't have much more time. You got to go. But what we had talked about progress a little bit, or you had mentioned that you want to see progress with this. And what ultimately should or would that progress look like to you in terms of us sort of working together as Christians? And you know what I mean? And besides just, because I've got down here study history, and I actually have quite a bit, but I need to teach it to the kids. I've got a whole series of stuff I'll talk about some other time. Sure. Because we homeschool them. But what would you like to see, or what do you think that progress should look like?
Yeah, so I think that I believe in the sovereignty of God. I really do. And I think that there are times when history and cultural context can give rise to a movement within the church to align more rightly with God's nature and his word. And so I think about the Reformation. Now, I'm personally, I'm not Reformed, but when I think about the Reformation, given what was going on in the Catholic Church, right? The Reformation, that gave, the abuses in the Catholic Church gave rise to a better understanding of how we ought to engage, basically where the grace of God fits into the picture of the believer, or non-believers for that matter, and gave rise to, really examining, sovereignty and so forth, right?
Right.
And so I think that, while I'm not Reformed myself, I do think that there's some positives that came out of that, right?
Right.
So likewise, I do think that when we think about how the West was built, you have this intermingling between the ideas from the Enlightenment period. You have this Christian, foundation woven in there. And then unfortunately, you also have this racial aspect kind of all mixed together in terms of how the West developed. I think there actually is an opportunity for the church to navigate these things in such a way that we function more like, Christ than we otherwise would. Now, let me be more explicit. I kind of want to just frame it a little bit. So the Bible has an awful lot to say about justice. It has an awful lot to say about what it really means to be a neighbor. I'm saying, as Jesus referred to with the Good Samaritan, right? And I think that what we can do as within the body of believers, what ought to happen is we ought to get in the scriptures, see what the Bible has to say about the kinds of things that have, become stumbling blocks from a racial standpoint. And in applying what the Bible has to say, we will find ourselves being more active agents for the kingdom within our context, really being the salt of the earth. You know what I'm saying? And I think we can be more potent because I'm to be honest with you, now everybody wouldn't agree, but I don't believe that there is an answer for the racial dilemma, if you will, the race problem out there in the world. I think the best chance, for it to be addressed is from the church. You know what I'm saying? But I think it's going to have to be through applying biblical principles and saying, hey, what does the Bible have to say about loving your neighbor? And how can I apply that to my Black brother? How can I apply that to my white brother? And in doing that, now what's going to happen is, we'll be able to exemplify what Jesus said, that they will know that you're my disciples based on how you love one another, right?
Yeah.
If you see Christians, right, loving one another across racial lines, across, distinctions and so forth, you see them loving one another in the way that we were created to, that agape love, that phileo, all kind of, just the breadth of the love that we're supposed to be loving each other with. That, how is that not a light to the world? I mean, in our current context, right? Amen. How would that not shed light on the power of the gospel to have a people who have transcended just this heinous, racially, saturated history and context, and be able to transcend that with love? That right there is a powerful testament to the gospel. And so what I want to see is for that to happen. You know what I'm saying? Now, the Bible talks about how everybody's right in their own eyes. But when your neighbor comes and checks you out, that's when, things get real, basically. I'm kind of, that's the Adam Coleman paraphrase, but we've got neighbors, and we need to go and see about one another and say, look, here's where you're a little bit off. Here's what the Bible has to say, and let the Bible speak to us as a collective and move forward together, because that's the only way that we're going to be as potent as we ought to be within these current times. And so ultimately, and I frame it that way because the gospel has to be front and center. And I think that the best way that we can really harness, these race problems in America and, utilize them as a stepping stone towards, demonstrating the gospel and proclaiming the gospel is to apply what the Bible has to say, be transformed ourselves and move forward as I described. Now, with that being said, also the scope of the gospel, I think, is far more broad than we often appreciate. You know what I'm saying? So God is through the process of sanctification, the Holy Spirit is creating the kinds of people that love other people. That's what he does, because we're being conformed to the image of Christ. Now, if we understand, I know we got to wrap it up, but if we understand that being made in the image of God, if we understand what that means, and people, actually, shameless plug, people can go on my channel. I did a whole talk on it, the image of God in modern times. An aspect of that is that we've been created for this collective project of harnessing the world and stewarding it in a way that God would, as God's representatives. That's part of what it means to be made in the image of God. And so we're, in a sense, we're all in this human experience together. So that means that, just kind of being really given a snippet version, we ought to care about the well-being of others. We ought to care about, the image of, other image bearers, right, and their well-being. Yeah. If you're a Christian in government, you ought to be concerned about the common good, right? You ought to be governing for the common good. If you have the ability to, fortunately, we're in America where we can exercise our civil liberties and voting and so forth to influence what's going on in society. We ought to be voting and engaging in the public square in such a way that it promotes the common good and well-being and so forth. That's all throughout the Bible. You know what I'm saying? That's all throughout Scripture. I'm saying that we ought to be people who care about the well-being of other people, not just Christians, you know what I'm saying, but just people in general, those who are made in the image of God. Now, if you have people functioning like that, then man, that's just a huge sledgehammer against whatever kind of injustice or oppression or manifestations of depravity functioning through systemic systems. I mean, societal systems. I'm saying, right. We ought to combat all of that. And so I think that last thing I'll say about this. Now, this is just my personal pet peeve. And you can maybe edit this out later if need be. But one of my pet peeves is this notion that the term of being a social justice warrior is a pejorative. And I'm gonna tell you why. Because what's happened is that the left, and I'm speaking politically now, I'm saying liberals and the left and society in general have hijacked certain biblical truths, created an unbiblical caricature of what those truths are, and then employed them in their liberal agenda, and thus sullied or besmirched, certain values that are actually biblical. You know what I'm saying? And now what's happening is when people like myself speak on certain things, we're cast off as being social justice warriors in kind of a one-to-one correlation to basically being a leftist. But the problem is that these values have been hijacked by people who are ungodly, and we need to reclaim them. I'm saying we need to reclaim these kind of things. Like leftists don't have the market on being concerned about others or something like that, or just from a certain perspective. There's biblical values. And so what's happening is I think that Christians, we've got this bag of values that, from a political standpoint, on the left side of the house, they've got a little bit from our bag. On the right side, they've got a little bit from our bag, but we've got the whole bag. And unfortunately, we're tethering ourselves to one group or another and thus leaving some aspects of our bag out when we really need to reclaim the full biblical worldview and walk it out, even in our engagement in the public square. And I think if we do that, then we find ourselves really butting up against individuals on all sides of the political spectrum, but at the same time exemplifying what it really means to be a Christian, to be like Christ.
Amen. We got one comment from I know Benjamin Handelman saying, Ben, we need this conversation to go on for like another 12 hours, and another comment saying this needs to be weekly. And hey guys, I'm down with talking to Adam about this anytime he wants to, because there's so much that I think does need to be said. And I wanted to throw something in on this and correct me where you think I'm wrong on this, Adam, please. Okay. For the first part, I think you'll agree with. Guys, notice that the principle of charity here, both Adam and I are trying to practice where we're not doubting one another's experiences. Sure. There's at no point he said something and I've gone, oh, that's not right. That's not my experience. Instead, it's, oh, really? What's that like? What's that? So that's part of that. We want to treat one another with that and learn from it and figure out how to do better, in the world, so to speak. Although I think I'm the one being taken to school here, but it's awesome. So that's the first part. And then secondly, in doing this, guys, I don't think any of us on any side of the fence of any race, creed, culture, whatever, need to belittle ourselves in order to do this. Now, particularly here, I'm talking about people apologizing for their whiteness. Now, if they've done something wrong there where they need to apologize for that, hey, by all means. And Adam, if you think I'm wrong about that, please throw in there. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm okay with that. I'm willing to accept that.
No, well, so again, and this kind of gets into, so maybe I can put the description in the chat later on, but I did a talk about how our, I'll just put it this way, our earthly identities stand in relation to, the Imago Dei,
right.
So by earthly, I mean like nation, ethnicity,
right.
These other sorts of things. And from my perspective, I believe that there's this complementary relationship between unity and diversity. Right?
Amen. Amen. Yeah.
Question, right? There should be a complementary relationship. And if you use one to militate against the other, then you're going to be off the mark biblically. Right. Yeah. So that means that, so how that plays out is, it's funny. Somebody asked me a question one time. They said that they had, they were upset that there was somebody of African-American descent wearing one of those African medallions at church. And he was like, well, how would you feel if I wore a German medallion? I'm like, all right, cool. Like, they go for it. I don't care. You're saying if I come to your house and shoot, maybe we'll have some bratwurst or I don't know, whatever y'all eat. I mean, that's fine, right? Like, I don't think there should be, like, nobody has to apologize for being white. You know what I'm saying? Nobody has to apologize for being whatever you are. What we need to be doing is taking whoever, God sovereignly created us to be, you know what I'm saying? And bringing out the best of it by, living out the Imago Dei, you know what I'm saying? And that's what we ought to be doing. So I don't have a problem with people saying, I love living in America. I love being an American. Okay, cool. Whatever. That's not an issue. As long as you're not taking that being an American and then situating it within your self-concept such that it overshadows the Imago Dei in yourself or others, then whatever, fine. That's not a problem at all. And here's, I want to say this too. So, and let me just kind of, be clear. So I think there's a great deal, and I'll just be explicit. I'm just being completely honest. I think there's a great deal that, the white Christian community can learn from the African Americans in terms of understanding what life is like here in America.
Yeah.
With that being said, there's also things that, can be learned from the African American side. I'm gonna give you a perfect example. And I don't think he would mind me sharing this, but my man, Tim Stratton, we were talking one day, right? And we were talking about racial issues or whatever. And he said something about how when he was younger, he was starting to, lose his hair a little bit. And, just given how he looked, he was concerned that people, if he shaved his hair off, he was concerned about shaving off his hair off because he didn't want people to look at him with like the way that he has his beard and all that kind of stuff and think that he was like some sort of like white supremacist neo-Nazi type dude.
That's a real thing.
So he had like some real angst about shaving his hair. Now for me, I hadn't even thought about that. I was like, you know what, dang, I can see how if you're a person who genuinely is in Christ, you're doing your level best, to expunge yourself from any sort of racial whatever, and you really love your brothers and sisters in Christ and whoever, saying on the basis of them being in the Imago Dei, being sisters and brothers in the Lord or whatever. And if somebody were to come to you and allege that you are racist when you are doing everything you can, saying to be free of that, then I can see how there would be some angst there. Like that makes sense to me. It's like, okay, and I really had to think about it. I was like, okay, I can see why there are people who are defensive about being labeled racist when they're really not. And I can see how that would make it difficult to engage in conversations about race because you don't want to be called a racist. I mean, who would, right? If you're really not a racist, why would you want to be called that? I was with some folks out in LA. We were going in Cali, and we had a pretty long drive, and it's kind of funny to me, but because I could tell they wanted to ask some questions about race, but I could tell they were hesitant as well. And at one point, I said, look, man, we can have a real conversation about this. I'm not going to turn into Samuel Jackson on y'all and just start screaming and like it doesn't have to be that. We can have an honest conversation, an intelligent conversation about these things. And I'm a Christian, you're a Christian, and as long as somebody's not being disrespectful, I can talk about whatever. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. That's fine. If you don't know something, you don't know. That's fine, and we can share and sharpen one another. That's how it ought to be. I'm really about that, and so I totally forgot where I was going. Oh yeah, so my point is, believers, we ought to be able to sharpen one another on these kinds of things and understand that we all have blind spots. Just acknowledge them and try to grow. You know what I'm saying? And that's for everybody, whatever color, whatever background we are. We all have blind spots, and we ought to always be open to growing towards Christ, no matter what it is. But but again, I mean, to answer your question, I don't think anybody has to be ashamed of being white, Asian, black, whatever. I mean, when God created you, he created you, and he did it for a purpose. You know what I'm saying? I'll leave that at that. I could say more, but I don't want to take up too much time.
You're good, brother. I'll keep you, but I know you've got a tight schedule today, so you're fine. And that to me always seemed more racist than not when people would sort of try to lower themselves or another group, whoever it was, in order to try to elevate another one. Because to me, if that makes sense, I see that as an insult because it sounds like the group you're trying to elevate can't be elevated on their own merits.
Sure, right.
And I think they can. I see a lot of value, like you're saying. I like the fact that there's so much cultural differences because I learned so much from that. I mean, after all, if people don't know, my wife's not Caucasian. So
well, they probably do now.
Japanese.
You get a picture up,
So. Yeah. So if you guys, she's Japanese. She's born and raised in Japan. She came over to the U.S. when she was about 16. I'll let her talk about that in another episode. But if you come to our house, it's going to be very different than my brother's house. His wife is from Panama. She's Panamanian. So we don't. In my family, I don't see anything wrong with it. I enjoy diversity, but obviously, I see that as a value and a plus. But anyway, the point that I wanted to get to was just lowering one group down to raise another one up. To me, seems backward. It seems like we ought to be just raising that group up by learning more about them and understanding and whatnot. So that's really all.
I mean, there's a beauty. I mean, because the thing is, like God, and we don't want to go too far afield, but God is intrinsically, or I'd say intrinsically social. I mean, obviously because he's the Trinity, he's been social from eternity past, right?
Yeah.
Now we're made in God's image, you know what I'm saying, and along with that comes the capacity to be social. You know what I'm saying, there's a teleology. God wants us to function in a certain way such that we can relate to him and relate to one another, right? So we have this capacity to socialize, to connect with other beings and in a particular sort of a way, right? Now, with that comes the potential for the development of cultures, societies, and so forth. Because as we relate to one another, there's going to be common grounds that are built such that we can, relate in a consistent manner, right?
Yep.
So now, if you've got a particular people that live in this geographical area, and one group that lives in that geographical area, both with those social capacities, cultures are going to grow up, you know what I'm saying, in those different areas that probably diverge from one another. But there's going to be some coherence in terms of this cultural experience over here and one over there. And then when they intersect, what ought to happen is there ought to be a valuing between both cultures, because both of them stem from the Imago Dei in one way or the other, right? And then as they value one another, and maybe there's going to be some cultural sharing, and maybe there won't be, whatever, it should create a more beautiful picture, a more beautiful mosaic, right? But what happens is Satan gets in the mix. Sin gets in the mix and says, no, these two cultures, they're not going to interact with one another from a perspective of mutual respect. They're not going to interact with one another from a sharing and mutual kind of love type of thing. No, I'm going to create enmity here. I'm going to take those distinctions that ultimately arise from the Imago Dei between these cultures, and I'm going to, cause them to be at each other's neck. So now mankind can't function as a collective Imago Dei, because being part of made in God's image is both individual and collective. Right. So mankind is not going to operate in this collective Imago Dei fashion, because I've disrupted that fellowship. I've disrupted that potential for unity with this enmity that's springing up from this diversity. That's the enemy there. You know what I'm saying? And so we can get into the Tower of Babel, all that kind of stuff. I mean, kind of talk about that too, kind of how that fits in that picture.
I was thinking about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that God, his intent is to have this diversity complementing unity. You know what I'm saying? And then to some extent, it's just like in the same way that what the enemy meant for evil, God will use for good. You know what I'm saying? So in that same way, I think that the Tower of Babel can still function to bring about more diversity without conflicting with God's overall picture of having this unity and diversity complementing one another.
Amen.
So yeah.
Amen. One question, Adam, that I saw that came up that you didn't answer, that feel free to take your time or be sure. I'm not quite sure the question, but it looks like it's coming from SPAL. I'm not sure the name there, but what does Adam think about the pre-Christian communities in the Middle East prior to Islam, post-Arianism? So I'm assuming they mean in Africa, maybe, but I'm not entirely sure. Whoever that was.
So what do I think about the pre-Christian
communities in the Middle East prior to Islam? So I guess before 600 AD. Let me look at the question again. Sorry, I'm reading it off my phone.
Yeah, maybe they can frame it in a way that kind of gets me more in proximity of what they're looking for me to say. Now, I could answer in a general sense. I think that, again, and I hate to be redundant, but this is just really my thought process. We're all made in the image of God.
Amen.
Right? And you think about Romans chapter 1 through 3. I mean, there's this general revelation, right?
Yeah.
That's you're going to find reflected in every culture. So I think I said it to say I think you're going to find inklings of the Imago Dei and inklings of the general revelation in all cultures, right? And where you see them, I think we can appreciate that. Right. So in the same way that Paul, he's in Athens and he's like, look, you got this shrine to the unknown God. He didn't put him down for that. He just said, okay, this sense of the divine, right? That's general revelation. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to help you to connect between this piece of general revelation to the special revelation of the cross, Jesus, and so forth. Right. And so I think that's kind of how we can view any given culture is say, okay, where's the general revelation here? You know what I'm saying? Where are the inklings of the Imago Dei, and let's esteem that. Let's prop that up, and then bring the gospel in, the special revelation to take people the rest of the way. So I don't think there's any culture that we have to demonize, in its entirety. You know what I'm saying? I think you're gonna it's somewhere along the line you're gonna find some inkling of the Imago Dei, and then where that culture, where the depravity props up is like the wheat and the tares, that Jesus talks about. We can cast that off.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Or
it does. It makes.
I hope that addresses their question. I'm not sure, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I have an inkling of what they were asking, but perhaps they're asking about the sort of African American. There was this brother. I don't know if it was Kemetic theology or what that was trying to say that Christianity is, which you addressed early on in the stream, the white man's religion, and of course, yeah. But the problem is we have, of course, African communities long before, a long time before it was spread into Europe the way it had, and there were Christian communities there. So I don't know if that's what they meant or where they were going with it.
Well, let me try it this way. So let's divide it between like East Africa, let's say Central, and then West Africa. Now, gotcha. The Africans that are here in the West primarily came from West Africa, gotcha. And some Central, like the Congo. But when you're talking about East Africa, I mean, I'm thinking about Ethiopia. I'm thinking about Egypt. I'm thinking about areas like Carthage, North Africa. Formerly Roman North Africa, Sudan. I mean, in all those areas, Christianity flourished at various different points. I mean, shoot, the Sudan, ancient Christian Nubia, was a Christian nation from 500 AD to about 1400 AD. So I mean, so nearly 1,000 years, you have this Christian nation on the continent of Africa, with all that being prior to the transatlantic slave trade. Yeah. Ethiopia was declared a Christian nation, like with the 4th century or so, whatever that was. So I mean, anyway, my whole point is you have Christianity flourishing. Christianity has been on the African continent for about 2,000 years now. That's not even arguable. It's been there, right? Now, with that being said, in any of those areas, or West Africa more specifically, where people like myself, more than likely derive, you're going to have some pre-Christian communities. There's no doubt about that. And these communities, they weren't monolithic. I mean, there's all different kinds of belief systems that flourished among them. You do have, say, the Fulani, for example. My understanding is that they were essentially Muslim, at least around the time where the transatlantic slave trade kicks off. You have other groups like the Ewe, the Dahomey, the Yoruba, who are going to be practicing what we might refer to as indigenous, or some would say animistic religions, where you have, say, like a pantheon of gods in some ways manifesting through, nature in some way. They had those kind of belief systems. I mean, all different kinds of belief systems. But one thing that I think is often underappreciated. Now, remember I spoke about a minute ago how you have the Imago Dei and general revelation present in all cultures.
Right.
Some of these African, pre-Christian African belief systems were not as far removed from the biblical worldview as is often assumed. I'm saying you do have some tribes in Africa that are straight up monotheistic. You know what I'm saying? You have some tribes that had a what they refer to as a high god, or sometimes it'll be referred to as a sky god. I'm thinking about like Chokwu, Chikinge, Inyame, Oludumare. I mean, these are all deities that were considered to be like the high god. You know what I'm saying?
Supreme. Yeah.
So, the supreme. So there was this concept of a most high, right? And so put it this way, the most common features that you're going to see, I want to say, in African indigenous religions is that there's going to be some sort of high god, and then you're going to have like this lower pantheon of deities, and then kind of somewhere beneath that you're going to have human beings who have died and gone on to become divine ancestors, if you will. I'm saying, or ancestors enjoying some special spiritual status, right? And these deities in between interact with the ancestors and individuals here who are still here. So you got this in between realm of spiritual beings between humans and the Most High, and often the Most High is considered to be like totally transcendent, like having no direct dealings with mankind after creation. Now, I said it to say this, so when you think about these common features, the notion that Jesus, for example, can be an intermediary between man and God, that's not a foreign concept to Africans. They understand that. I'm saying the notion that you can have a sacrifice that brings about a certain outcome from a spiritual standpoint, that's not foreign to Africa. I'm saying that. Or the notion of having a most high, then that's not foreign to Africa. So there's these features of their spiritual system that are not totally divergent from features of the biblical worldview, which is why in some instances, some tribes, it was a very short leap to go from being whatever they were practicing to being a Christian. As a matter of fact, some tribes, indeed, their perspective was that, they say, if you were in a war and your people group was conquered by another people group, that was considered to be evidence that whatever God they serve must be the true God. Right. So for some Africans, it was very natural for them to convert to Christianity because their people had been subjugated, which was for them have been evidence that, well, obviously we weren't serving the right God.
Right.
So therefore we need to, go with somebody else. Right. So that thought process was not non-African. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I bring that up to say that this idea that somehow Christianity is this alien, totally other worldview that is in no way overlapping with whatever was practiced in West Africa, that's a myth. That's not true at all. There's a reason why people of African descent latched onto the biblical worldview.
Amen.
And no, it's not because they were just beat into it. That's a myth that's been perpetuated by individuals like Louis Farrakhan and a whole host of other individuals that just flat out are not telling the full story of history. Yeah, so I don't know if you want to go further than that, but
no, that's awesome, brother. And let me just say too, everybody, I know I've been saying this over and over again, but look, if people want to ask you, especially if you're coming from two different cultures, backgrounds, doesn't matter, race, creed, color, whatever, be sure not to belittle them. Notice Adam's being very kind to me with my ignorance when I ask a question. He's not being like, oh, you don't know that, what, and none of that. It's always be kind and answer those questions. And you're going to find so much more common ground, I think, in the end, and it's going to move the ball further. And I
don't mean to cut you off, but
go ahead.
Let me be explicit in saying that part of the reason why I can be patient with others is because everything that I'm saying, I didn't know it either. It was until like 5-6 years ago. Like, let's say, I'll say 6-7 years ago. The reality is, I could go on forever. I mean, there's so many elements of history that have been left out of the common telling of history that if you start, digging, you're like, man, I didn't know this. I didn't know that. Like, let me give you a perfect example, right? When you think about and this might speak to the previous person's question. When you think about enslaved persons encountering Christianity during the transatlantic slave trade, antebellum South, and so forth, right? Mm-hmm. Most people don't know that conversion to Christianity was actually a form of personal resistance against the system of chattel slavery. Let me explain that. So slavery wasn't just the physical shackling of individuals, right?
Right.
There was also this internal oppression as well, because you're saying that these people who ought to be treated as persons are just biological farm equipment, basically, right?
Right. Yeah.
Now, with that being the case, what you find now this, you're not going to get this from, the popular false teachers that are out here. You got to go to the actual historical record, which is what I did. I started going into the slave narratives and reading, the slaves in their own words, talking about their experiences with Christianity. And what you find is, matter of fact, there's one of my favorite ones. I think it's I don't know why I'm losing now, but there's this quotation from enslaved person. Actually, I'll put it in the chat later. That way you can fact check me on it. It's J.L. Bost, W.L. Bost, I think is what it is. That's his name. And so he says that he talks about how he says that the slave masters feared for Africans to get any religion and education, but I reckon something on the inside just told us about God and that there was a hope for life hereafter. That's what he says, right? Now, what I find is interesting is that, that's when I first, kind of came in contact with this historical reality that many slave masters opposed the preaching of the gospel. But, kind of moving forward, what you see is enslaved persons practicing Christianity independent of, slave master supervision, which was illegal at the time. And so there would be times where they would, they often talk about sneaking off into hush harbors, right? So where, say during the daytime of doing the work, a certain person might break a tree branch that would point the direction of where that hush harbor would be at night. And they would steal away at night and pray and worship God independent, the Christian God specifically. And they would worship him on their own terms and independently. And often, they talk about how they would pray or sing into a basin of water because the water would catch the sound and dampen the sound. Because if they got caught, they would get beaten or killed. Right. Or there's another instance where they talked about they would take wet blankets and they would create an enclosure, which they refer to as a tabernacle, and they would worship God. You know what I'm saying? But again, those wet blankets were different.
It absorbs sound. Yeah.
Right. So they didn't want to be killed. So these are people who were Christians and were practicing independently and in secret, because if they had been practicing Christianity, you know what I'm saying, without the supervision of, the slave master, they could have been killed or so forth. But let me go back to my point about conversion was, in a sense, a form of personal resistance. So I tell this story all the time. It's my favorite conversion story that you come across by a man named Josiah Henson. Now, Josiah Henson, many people have heard the term Uncle Tom, which is a derisive term nowadays, but originally that wasn't the case. Originally, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, and the character Uncle Tom was supposed to be was depicted in showing the humanity of the enslaved person. And actually, she took some attributes of the character of Christ and fused them with this Uncle Tom character to show the humanity of the slave. So it was a part of her abolitionist work. And then later on, the term Uncle Tom got flipped around and turned as a negative. But originally, that wasn't the case. Now, Uncle Tom was actually based on a real person named Josiah Henson. Josiah Henson, Reverend Josiah Henson, I should say, was an enslaved person who escaped slavery. And long story short, he goes on to become an abolitionist. He travels the world speaking against slavery, and he lives in Canada for a while, overseas for a while. And in his autobiography, later on in life, he talks about how he wanted to show his wife where he had come from, the plantation. So he takes her back there, and this is at the end of his biography. He says that at this point, mind you, slavery's over, the Civil War has already happened, all this kind of stuff.
Okay.
And he goes back to the plantation. There's nobody there to farm it, so it's like all overgrown with brush and just looking terrible and everything. And at this point, his former slave master had passed away. He wasn't aware of it at first, but his former slave person had passed away, and so he goes in to see the wife of the slave master, right? And so he goes in there, and she's just in really bad shape physically. I mean, she can't hardly see. She's just really bad. She's bedridden and so forth. And so he goes in and says, hey, it's Josiah, Josiah Henson. It's Josiah. Right. And she doesn't recognize him, And so earlier in his biography, he talked about how he had sustained some injuries to his arms, some scars that he had carried with him for life, and he had sustained them while saving the life of his slave master previously. Right.
Oh, wow. So
that was a distinctive mark for him, was the markings on his arms. So the slave master's wife, at this point, at the end of his biography, she doesn't recognize him. So he allows her to feel his arms so that she can know who he was. So she feels his arms, and immediately she says, "Oh, Sai." It was short for Josiah. She says, "Oh, Sai, I'm sorry to tell you this, but your master is dead and gone." And then he replies, he says, "No, madam. My master is yet alive." And he was talking about Jesus Christ. I mean, man, that is just powerful. When I first read that, I mean, I was sitting actually in the room right next to me right now, and I just wept, man, because it was such a powerful testament. Yeah, it really just exemplified that for the enslaved person, your conversion to Christianity was like a testament that you might have my body, but you can't have my soul.
Amen.
And I just think that it's so powerful that people understand that how potent Christianity was as a personal resistance. But then also, I mean, you can't talk about the abolitionist movement without talking about Christianity.
Yeah, that's right.
There is no more potent worldview for the liberty of African people of African descent in the West than Christianity. There isn't one. You know what I'm saying? And I'll debate anybody on that. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? I'll give this one example, then I guess we can move on to the next question. But
okay.
Perfect example, Frederick Douglass, right? Mm-hmm. We know about Frederick Douglass, the speech maker. We know about Frederick Douglass, the writer. But one thing they never tell you about is Frederick Douglass, the preacher. Then Frederick Douglass was a lay preacher in his church. As a matter of fact, his probably his hallmark written work, the North Star, which was a publication, an abolitionist publication, right, a newspaper at the time, he actually published the North Star, out of the basement of an AME church.
Oh, wow.
Right? As a matter of fact, in his biography, he talks about how there were some white guys in his area. He was looking to open up what he called a Sabbath school. It was basically a Sunday school. He wanted to teach reading, he wanted to teach the Bible. This is what Frederick Douglass wanted to do. And these white folks came to him and said, "Look, unless you want to get 2 bullets in the chest, just like Crispus Attucks did, we suggest you not start that school." You know what I'm saying? He wanted to start a Sabbath school and teach the Bible. This is Frederick Douglass. Now, you never hear about that. Yeah. You never hear about that side. And I can give you many more examples, but there's this rich Christian history that flows throughout African-American history that has been so muted. It's not even funny. I'll just leave it at that. But there's so many things that we don't know. And I'm Black. I grew up hearing about this stuff, and I didn't know about it till fairly recently. You know what I'm saying? And so I think we really need to reclaim that, because we see how the gospel, takes hold in the African-American community and really produces some phenomenal individuals, who went on to do some great things.
Amen, brother. Yeah. And you let me know, Adam, what, when you run out of time, brother, because I don't want to.
Yeah. I got a few more minutes left, and then we'll slide out. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So another question was, what approach by Mr. Phil Fox? Thank you for the question. Mm-hmm. What approach to apologetics do you find most effective within ethnic communities?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Well, so I guess he's probably referring to, like, say, presuppositionalism versus like evidentialism.
I think so.
This is actually, it's funny you should ask. So recently, I've become more. I wouldn't consider myself to be a presuppositionist proper. You know what I'm saying? I do think that there are times when a presuppositionalist friendly approach is most appropriate. You know, given a particular conversation. So, say for example, we're talking about slavery. You know, that's going to be a big one. You know, why did God allow Black people to go into slavery? Right now, if I'm dealing with an atheist, I'm like, well, that's a great question, but why is slavery a problem in the first place? On your worldview, can you explain to me why you have a problem with slavery? You know what I'm saying? As a matter of fact, if slavery, if let's say naturalism is true, right? And let's say that the best account of why we have human beings here at all, or biological diversity and humans arising from it, let's say that, you know, the best account of that is evolution, right?
Yeah.
Well, if that's true, and survival of the fittest is the story of evolution, you know, it can basically, right? That's the survival of the fittest is the name of the game. Then actually, slavery was right.
Yep.
You know, and if you're an atheist, then you should have been glad about slavery, because you have people subjugating those that they could have power over to survive.
That's right.
Right. So you shouldn't have a problem with slavery if you're an atheist.
And
or more naturalist, just to say, you know, evolutionists. So I want to demonstrate how the inconsistencies in their worldview can account for their moral outrage about slavery. And then we can talk about, you know, the biblical worldview and how we can give an answer to that. So that would be a presuppositionalist kind of approach. You know what I'm saying? I want to, you know, just snatch away, you know, their presupposition, their moral presupposition there, and then bring them back to the biblical worldview. So, you know, so sometimes I'll apply something like that. And then there's other times where I think being an evidentialist can work a little better. And now, to some extent, it may depend on what group you're dealing with. So let me give an example. So I just talked about how an atheist, you know, I might approach the moral issue, you know, with an atheist, right?
Right.
Now, a Hebrew Israelite, on the other hand, they're going to appeal to scripture as well. I'm saying that they hold that to be their central text.
Amen.
So in some regards, some presuppositional arguments may not work with them, because they're functioning off, you know, they're still going to be looking to the Bible as their ultimate source as well. Now, obviously their interpretations are wrong.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? But, you know, so certain arguments from a precept standpoint may not work as well there. And, you know, I might have to dip into another bag, but, you know, it really depends on what group you're dealing with and, you know, what the conversation is. But I've recently become, as I've learned more about presuppositionalism, I think I don't really see why there has to be a beef between the evidentialists and the precepts that we tend to see online. I think that if both groups really understand one another, I think that they can have a respect for one another. And I'm not saying Phil Fox doesn't. I want to make sure I'm not.
Oh yeah, no,
I'm just talking in general. You know,
right.
I know Phil Fox. Phil Fox is a great brother. But I think that they can be complementary in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm.
I agree with you. And there are times when I slide into evidentialism, I'll move in and out depending on what I can, you know, if I can start with the word of God, that's where I'm going.
Yeah,
and
like,
if I can
steal it from God. I mean, I think it's a perfect example. You know, I mean, it's very precept friendly, I think, you know.
Yep. That's what I was just going to say is, hey, and if I can use a tag argument to demonstrate exactly that, like that book, then I'm going to do it. So
sure.
Yeah, I agree with you, brother. And then, and great answer, by the way.
Mm-hmm,
and if you guys didn't notice, also something I said earlier on, I'm just going to brag on Adam, is that he's not just good at this cultural thing. He's a brilliant man when it comes to, I don't want you guys to think of him as being only peg, you know, put him in one peg there. Brilliant all around apologist as well. So I want you guys to
thank you. I appreciate that.
Oh, yes, sir.
And to be fair, I don't know. There's a number of urban apologists we have out here, and I don't know any of them that isn't. I mean, we got guys out here, man. I would encourage people to check out the Cyber City Conference.
Okay.
It was an online apologetics conference where he had a bunch of urban apologists teamed together, and we all had like our sessions online. It actually was kind of phenomenal because the Corona shutdown had just happened. And so, you know, it was kind of, I guess, Providence, I guess. You know, we had this online conference. It's totally free. I want to say it's at cybercityconference.com, I believe, and you can access all the sessions there, but you'll get a really good sampling of the other individuals that some of the folks I named already, like Nefertiti, Alfredo Valentin, shout out to my man, Damon Richardson, Eric Mason. Those two weren't in the conference, but they're also phenomenal as well. So yeah, it's not just me. I mean, I want to make sure I'm giving props to everybody else as well, you know.
Yeah, I'll put a link to that too. I'll try to dig it up, and then I'll put a link to that later on, guys, in the description, so you can look for that there for those watching in the future. And I'll try to have links to a lot of this stuff for y'all.
Yeah.
Awesome. Anything else, brother, that you wanted to mention before? I know you got to go, guys. I'm not trying to kick Adam off. I know a lot of you are saying you guys keep going.
I got family coming, so I appreciate you. I'm sorry to have to cut it short, because I love this conversation. But I mean, hey, you know what it is, man. We definitely have to. I want to have you on my channel, and I definitely
appreciate it, brother.
This conversation again on your channel as well.
You're welcome. Weekly, brother. I mean it. Anytime you want. I don't want to commit you to anything because I get it, but I'm just saying,
sure.
Literally, you are welcome anytime. We love having you, and obviously, everyone else enjoys hearing you speak. They're blessed by it. So,
well, I appreciate you giving me a shot, man, to get on here and just kind of share my heart and give my perspective. And I hope that I didn't cost you any subscribers, or anything like that. You know what I mean? No worries. But no, seriously, man, it's been a great conversation. I thank you for being open-minded to have this conversation with me. And I mean, you've said a lot about me, but you're a brilliant guy as well, man. I hope you don't sell yourself short either. You know, I mean, I've been learning from you as well. I tap into you. I appreciate the source that you give me with Roger Chisholm and whatever, and so I'm gleaning from you as well, man. And this is a conversation I think that needs to happen. And you asked earlier, like what needs to happen in order to help things, and it's really these conversations right here. I think it's probably rare that maybe some people who are viewing right now have an opportunity to hear this kind of conversation amongst brothers in the Lord who are open, honest, and really digging in these scriptures, man, and are sound thinkers. So I think that these conversations need to happen. They really do. And I appreciate you for having me on, man.
Oh yeah, absolutely, brother. Absolutely. Well, hang tight for just 1 second. Hey, we love you all.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I'm the worst at promoting my stuff, and I really need to do better about it.
Yeah. Do that, please.
Please check me out on Tru-ID Apologetics. Tru-ID Apologetics.com. That's a website. YouTube channel, Tru-ID Apologetics. I got some great interviews coming up. I just interviewed Jonathan Pritchett from Trinity Radio. It just dropped yesterday. He's a phenomenal guy. I've got my guy Isaiah Robertson. If you like this conversation right here, there will be a similar one on my channel on Monday with the guy Pastor Isaiah Robertson. Rather, that's going to be phenomenal. And I got some more interviews and things coming up. So definitely check me out. And I love y'all, man. Love God, love people, and take care of the things that God blesses you with. I always like to share that with folks too.
All right, y'all. Hey, you heard it from the man. And there are links to some of that in the description. And if it's not there yet, it will be there soon. Take care, y'all. Adam, hang tight for a sec. God bless. We love y'all, and we will talk to you soon.